And good afternoon. I'm Chief Meteorologist Chris Franklin with the very latest on Tropical Storm Fiona. We are still watching it, just about now moving into the eastern Caribbean, and we are still not looking at any dramatic changes. The new forecast has come in from the National Hurricane Center, and really nothing dramatic over the course of this system. The only thing that really has been somewhat troublesome is the strength, and that is always the more difficult part of these tropical systems in forecasting, is the strength of the storm. However, the track forecast is usually far more accurate, and we have really not seen the models or the Hurricane Center deviate from even their earlier forecast, say of a couple of days ago. So no dramatic changes has occurred for the 4 o'clock, and all of that is good news for us. So let's take a look at the storm right now. As it is moving a little bit closer to the islands, we're starting to get it within radar range, so you can clearly see. I'm going to zoom in a little bit on it here. You can clearly see where that center of circulation is moving over the islands. You're just about over the island. So once it crosses the islands there, it'll be into the Caribbean. But note the lack of thunderstorms around that center. Wind shear and dry air have been plaguing this system really from the get-go when it was first classified as an invest. It never was able to really organize those thunderstorms around the center. Now, despite that, yesterday winds were able to get up to 60 miles an hour. We have since seen them decrease last night and steadily today. Not a continuing decrease, but winds have been maintained at only 50 miles an hour. Still a potent storm, can still do some damage, but certainly not the devastating storms that we have seen in past seasons. So there is the center now showing up on radar. And when I'm going to widen back out here just a little bit as we widen out here, as I switch back over to show the colorized satellite, note the lack of thunderstorms around that center. Most of the convection, the thunderstorms, are still well displaced to the east, and that will likely continue over the next couple of days. Once we head more toward late Saturday, Sunday, so let's say the next day or so, this will continue, the environment might become a little bit more hospitable for those thunderstorms to develop around the center, and a little bit of strengthening is likely. So don't be surprised if you see that over the weekend. However, the forecast, as again the Hurricane Center has issued, has not really changed dramatically. We're still looking at it moving generally to the south of Puerto Rico. They're still going to get some rainfall, but the center should stay offshore. If it were to move onshore, that would help to disrupt that circulation, as both Puerto Rico as well as Hispaniola very mountainous. Now, it will be crossing over Hispaniola, but really more the eastern tip as we head towards Sunday of the Dominican Republic before making a turn, possibly kind of avoiding most of the mountains. So note that the Hurricane Center does indicate some steady strengthening once it gets over the Turks and Caicos and then the eastern Bahamas, the southeastern Bahama Islands, and strengthening to possibly our third hurricane of the season, maybe by mid next week. But notice, we have not seen a change. The turn is expected to occur late this weekend, early next week, kind of a west-northwest, a northwest, and then eventually northerly direction, which will take this clear of Florida. We have seen far more model consensus over the last couple of days as well. Or really, I should say, we have seen model agreement over the last several days with this system, and that really has not changed. The spread is not nearly as great as we get into days 3 and 4, so the wider part of the forecast cone and the widening of the forecast models as we get later into the day 3, 4, 5, even 6 and 7 from these spaghetti plots. You do see a little bit of a spread, but not really dramatic. You don't see any outliers bringing it into the Gulf of Mexico, no outliers bringing it into Florida. All of them are in pretty good agreement of this eventual turn towards the north. Why is that? Well, it's because the surrounding environment has been fairly well forecasted. There's a big upper level ridge sitting just to the north of Fiona. This is pushing the storm along to the west. That's why that will continue for the next couple of days. As we approach the end of the weekend and early next week, this upper high just to the north of the islands will start to shift toward the east. As that happens, it creates a break in the ridge being connected from the central part of the nation all the way out into the Atlantic. This break right here is thanks to an upper level trough. This is a weakness in the atmosphere, and these storms want to take the path of least resistance and will turn into that weakness. So that is why it's going to very likely now turn into that weakness as it moves into more the early next week time frame. So next couple of days, probably even through much of the day Sunday, we're expecting that westerly motion because of the upper high to the north. Once that ridging kind of breaks down and this upper trough moves in along the East Coast, that's when the storm will start making that turn, and the models have been very good with forecasting this turn, and they really have not deviated from that over the last couple of days. One thing that we have been watching with Fiona again is that unorganization. The thunderstorms are not able to concentrate and develop around the center. The reason for that is it is surrounded by wind shear and dry air. Looking at the water vapor, this kind of looks at the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere as well as the moisture content in the atmosphere. So the bright blues, whites to bright blues and oranges, that's high concentrations of moisture. It is benefiting from a little pocket of moisture where all of the thunderstorms have been developing. But all around that, this more tan to black, that is dry air, and the storm is surrounded by this dry air. The forecast note are still calling for that dry air to persist in the next couple of days. It'll still be feeding off this little pocket of moisture, which may grow a bit more as we get into early next week once the storm is over the Atlantic, and it may be able to take advantage of an improving environment to allow it to strengthen somewhat. But over the next couple of days through the weekend, that dry air should hopefully kind of win out a bit and keep it as a weaker storm. Again, the upper atmosphere may become a little bit more conducive into the weekend to allow for a bit more strengthening, but at the moment winds at 50 miles an hour will increase a bit more into the Caribbean in a couple of days, but still maintaining its strength as a tropical storm. I'd also mentioned wind shear. That too has been plaguing the storm. What you're looking at here is the center of Fiona, and then just to the north you've got the oranges to these bright pinks and magentas. That is strong wind shear. The yellows are greens to blue, kind of weak to minimal wind shear. So there is still some wind shear with the storm up to the north of it. That may break off a bit more by the early part of the weekend, or by the weekend, the early part of the forecast period, to allow for a little bit of strengthening. And especially if the storm is able to not be impacted by the islands, we should see a steady increase in strength over the course of the next couple of days. Doesn't look like it'll be dramatic, but somewhat. And then note, as we get into early next week and the mid part of next week, the upper shear kind of really moves away from the storm, so it has a much better chance once over the Bahamas to perhaps strengthen a bit more as it continues, probably now looking at the model consensus away from the East Coast. It does look like the upper pattern with that deepening trough along the East Coast should keep this storm even away from the coast of the United States. So that is great news, certainly for the Gulf Coast, and also great news for all of the East Coast states, where it looks like at one time it could maybe clip or get a little bit closer to the coast itself, the eastern seaboard, but it looks like that probably is not going to happen. So that is the 4 o'clock advisory on Fiona. Again, we will get new information on the storm itself at 7 o'clock, but we won't get a new track until 10. So until then, we're not going to see any dramatic changes to Fiona or the forecast itself. And likely by the 10 o'clock advisory later on tonight, we also will not see any dramatic changes. In fact, I usually post before 10 o'clock when we get the new model runs come in. The models that I've been showing you are the ones that the Hurricane Center uses to then produce their track. So if we see kind of an adjustment in the model consensus, sometimes we then will see an adjustment by the Hurricane Center. But if we're not going to see anything like that for this evening, then I would likely venture to say we're not going to see any dramatic changes to the forecast from the National Hurricane Center. Again, in all of our newscasts, we'll have a complete look at the latest on Fiona, but this was allowing us to have a little bit more time to dive into all of the surrounding environments around Fiona, why we're thinking it going to stay weak a little bit next day or so, strengthen a bit more, and then why it could become our third hurricane of the season once it gets out over the Atlantic. But the point for us, no threat to the Gulf, and our weekend will stay quiet. For now, I'm Chief Meteorologist Chris Franklin.